Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jason Cannon, and on behalf of the Institute for Humane Studies, I'd like to welcome you to this lecture series with Professor Brandon Turner on liberalism and illiberalisms. Dr. Turner is a Lyceum professor for the Clemson University Institute for the Study of Capitalism and associate professor in the Department of Political Science there. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his research interests include the history of modern political thought, particularly British liberal thought, as well as theories of conservatism. The title of this lecture, his first of three, is Liberalism, Its Origin and Character. Professor Turner?
All right, thanks, Jason, and thanks to the Institute for Humane Studies. And I actually want to give a particularly strong thanks to Jason for being very flexible. These lectures were initially part of a summer seminar, and I came down with coronavirus, with COVID-19, and Jason was kind enough to let me off the hook, at least temporarily. And so we're now kind of, I'm paying a debt, as it were, to Jason and to IHS for their flexibility this summer, but I do want to acknowledge their flexibility in this regard. And I want to thank them too for inviting me to give a couple talks and to really give a couple talks on a related topic. So normally when I do these sorts of things, or when I do a section on liberalism in general, the liberal tradition, I have to, in some sense, sort of rush through the liberal tradition, or what counts as liberalism. I have to give essentially a kind of 45-minute undergrad version of what we mean by liberalism. And of course, this means I'm somewhat constrained by my own thoughts on liberalism, constrained by time, but also constrained by, in some sense, what is commonly meant by liberalism. I don't want to give an idiosyncratic view on something that's well established. So I'm going to take this chance to have these three lectures to try to say something somewhat idiosyncratic about the liberal tradition, about liberalism more generally. Anyway, I just wanted to say a few remarks there just to preface sort of what my approach is going to be over the next three sessions. So what is liberalism? My students get full credit if they can tell me that liberalism is something like the modern political ideology that emphasizes individual rights and limited government. Right? So if they can reproduce that on the exam, I'm pretty happy. And I think that's basically right. I don't think there's anything wrong about that. I think if the average citizen had that conception of liberalism in mind, I think we'd have a more healthy citizenry. But over time, I've noticed that I've begun to de-emphasize, when I teach this, I've begun to de-emphasize the sort of natural law or sort of top-down component of individual rights. And I've begun to emphasize the place of rights and constraints on government as they pertain to a specific normative view, a view that can't be demonstrably proven so much as taken as a given. That is, what it means to be liberal is to hold this view, and this view is something like that individuals ought to be as free as possible to pursue their own ends in their own time and in their own way. Right? So this seems to me a kind of bedrock moral commitment that unites all of the different liberalisms that might distinguish liberalism from competitors, particularly something like republicanism, particularly the kind of thick classical republicanism variety, or say socialism or communism. So I think this is basically right too, this basic normative commitment that individuals ought to be as free as possible to pursue their own ends in their own time and in their own way. But IHS is giving me the chance to dive a little bit deeper here, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to recline, I'm going to luxuriate a little bit. And I want to start with a few thoughts on what we talk about when we say, or when we talk about the liberal tradition. And so really there's two notions here that get kind of pushed together. First, the notion of liberal or liberalism, and then also the notion of tradition, what it means for something to constitute or to be considered a tradition. Now, we experience a kind of strange dynamic when we begin to think about liberalism, or about the adjective liberal, because we're thinking about a thing that is simultaneously everywhere and also nowhere in particular. The term itself is ubiquitous. We have liberal parties, we have liberal politicians, we have liberal democracies, liberal traditions, we have liberal arts, we are nearly all of us liberals, right? Very few people go around calling themselves illiberal. And we're all very wary of those who use words and ideas that can be labeled illiberal. Yet despite this ubiquity, or maybe more likely because of this ubiquity, we struggle to define it clearly enough to satisfy everyone, or really to satisfy anyone. Defining liberalism, even talking about liberalism in a way that tries to be fair and comprehensive, it has a kind of herding cats quality to it. Cats aren't made for herding, and one soon discovers that ideas aren't made for herding either. Not just ideas, but figures and texts. And I want to emphasize this even more. It's not just that it's difficult, if not impossible, to pitch a tent large enough and cleverly built enough to include all of the stuff we want to include under the liberal banner, under the banner of liberalism, or what counts as liberal, whether this stuff be principles and commitments, texts and authorities, attitudes and practices. It's that these things, this liberal stuff, turns out to be surprisingly and often frustratingly volatile, especially when kept together. And the literature recognizes this volatility in a number of ways. Consider, for example, just one example, consider the matter of the state. So we can imagine a spectrum moving left to right, but it's not particularly important. We can imagine a spectrum on which we might place various attitudes towards state responsibility and capacity, attitudes that have all, at one time or another, gone by the name liberal. So on the far left of the spectrum, we might find T.H. Green, a self-described liberal, which is somewhat rare actually within the liberal tradition, someone who refers to themselves as a liberal. Green, for whom the development of individual moral powers required large-scale state efforts to alleviate things like poverty and illiteracy. On this end of the spectrum, too, we might find figures like Alexander Hamilton, for whom an energetic federal government was needed to defend America's security and financial interests, or any number of 20th and 21st century policy wonk types on both sides of the aisle, left and right, for whom effective large-scale state intervention in the economy is needed to protect individuals in their capacity as consumers, as borrowers, or as stakeholders in a traditional family. We can look to the far opposite end of this spectrum, the same spectrum, and see there another batch of figures, another batch of ideas. We can see a host of libertarians or so-called minarchists like von Mises, Robert Nozick, and Ayn Rand, people who held that government was needed for the objective identification and reliable protection of individual rights and nothing else, and a version of the so-called night watchman state, or what Thomas Carlyle calls anarchy plus the constable. Indeed, if we squint and look even harder at this far right end of this sort of state capacity spectrum, we can find there, even further down the line, those who advocate that even the constable may be required to turn in his proverbial badge and gun. People like William Godwin, and even perhaps John Brown, who held that moral agency in its full development implied the abolition of the state and its agents of violence. And of course, we have 1,000 other names and movements and texts that can be slotted anywhere up and down our little spectrum. And the point here is not to place them. I mean, you could imagine an exercise where we place this diversity of views, but it's simply to acknowledge the incredible and indeed the seemingly nonsensical diversity of views on this one particular question that have at one time or another gone under the name of liberal. And of course, this question, the question of how far and in what ways a state ought to bring about ostensibly liberal outcomes, this is only one question that confronts us. In fact, when we look at it, we come to realize that liberalism, like most of the big and enduring political ideology, liberalism practically teems with these diversities, which is simply to say that the intellectual apartment in which we house the thing, liberalism, is pretty lousy with disagreements. Disagreements about what and who and which policies and which outcomes count as liberal. To this foregoing example, the one about state capacity and its role within a liberal society, We can add longstanding debates within the liberal community over the respective weights to be placed on liberty and equality, the appropriate amount of faith to be placed in democratic and majoritarian institutions, particularly when comparative anti-democratic constitutional mechanisms are available, the role of the market in determining social outcomes, the importance of associational or mediating institutions in reducing state domination, and in regulating the development of individuals, and many others besides. Right? I mean, any thinker, any figure is going to be taking up some position on some spectrum, all within the liberal tradition, even as they seem to disagree on fundamental things like whether or not there should be a state. Now, this indeterminacy isn't helped by the fact that we tend to discuss liberalism and political ideology in general in a way that runs together several related but ultimately distinct questions. Indeed, liberalism seems to be one possible answer to a myriad of important and difficult political theoretical questions. And I actually want to spend a moment naming and identifying several of these questions in order to make myself a little bit clearer on this point, and in order to begin to disentangle some of the mess that we are left with when we try to take in the liberal tradition as a whole or in a comprehensive fashion. So I've got, I think I have four here. I have four questions, political theoretical questions, for which liberalism is an answer, or provides a set of answers. So the first one, so liberalism is one possible answer to the question of how or on what terms legitimate political authority is brought about. So it's here that the so-called Anglo-American tradition of liberal thought, with Locke as its figurehead and Jefferson as its main popularizer, it's here that this tradition looms particularly large. Right? So liberals hold that government is rooted in a particular kind of authority that almost always satisfies two conditions. So first, and here I'm actually just borrowing Jefferson's phrasing in the Declaration of Independence, it on the one hand derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Secondly, it conforms in some way or another to a natural jurisprudential standard in which the natural rights of individuals are given primary moral weight. Right? So just in general, right, if we look at Locke, if we look at Jefferson, if we look at others in what is sometimes referred to as the rationalist or the top-down liberal tradition, we'll find them concerning themselves not exclusively, but predominantly with the question of on what terms is government legitimate? On what terms is government made moral? Nowadays, liberal authority is understood as a kind of evaluative ideal, and governments might be deemed more or less liberal, not in terms of the consent, so the explicit act of consent they've actually garnered, but rather according to whether or not a sufficiently well-informed and rational person would or ought to consent to them. So if we think about Rawls's approach to the question of legitimacy, or Jeremy Waldron's article from the 80s on basically what liberalism means, we see examples of this. Note that the Western analytical tradition of political philosophy, and if any of you out there are studying political philosophy, you might find yourself concerned primarily with this question, almost to the exclusion of others, the question of authority. So that's one question that liberalism presents itself as an answer to, or that we have a set of liberal answers to. Secondly, we can say that liberalism is also one possible answer, or a constellation of answers, to questions pertaining to what Michael Oakeshott calls the office of government. And by the office of government, we just mean the formal and perhaps informal institutions and ways through which government mobilizes and enacts whatever powers it can muster at a given time. So these answers we pull from guys like Hume and Madison, perhaps Tocqueville, but especially Montesquieu, right? These are the figures that loom large when it comes to answering this question. And it's with respect to questions of government office that we've come to recognize and to think about liberal politics, and especially liberal constitutionalism. When considering questions of how to best to organize the office of government, liberals tend to endorse several positions, which are sort of recognizably liberal. Separation of powers, for example, as well as any of the following, and this list is by no means exhaustive, but it represents, again, a set of answers, a set of liberal answers to this question. So we have constitutionalism, or the view that government activity ought to be itself limited by a mechanism, often written, whereby its powers are specified and enumerated. Federalism, or the position that government authority ought to be distributed between units who exercise authority in some specified domain. And representative democracy, an arrangement whereby the electorate, and here liberals have often, but by no means always, held a more expansive view of the electorate, of who counts, of how far suffrage ought to be extended. So an arrangement whereby the electorate selects its officers, and I note that this final bit ought not to be confused with popular sovereignty, which is actually relates to the question of authority. One final note on this institutional set of answers, insofar as it presents itself as a theory of institutions, that is, as far as it presents itself as a theory of the market, understood as an order, if even an undesigned order, market or laissez-faire liberalism seems to fit here in this second part, as a set of responses about what institutions best realize liberal outcomes. In other words, I take laissez-faire liberalism or market liberalism to be a response to the question of how best to organize governments. And I take various theories of associational life to be the same thing. So that's the second set of responses, or a second set of questions to which liberalism is a response. Here's a third one. If the question of authority is, for many liberals, a straightforwardly normative question, and if the question of arrangements of office is, if not normative, then sort of normative adjacent, then the third set of questions to which liberalism is a response is non-normative all the way through. The question here, the third question, is descriptive in character, and it goes something like this. The question is, how would one characterize our politics? And by our, I mean predominantly Western politics, but this is no longer exclusively the case. How would one characterize our politics, Western politics, over the past, say, 2 to 3 centuries? Right? That's a question to which liberal is an answer. It can't be denied that our politics operates within the world of the modern Weberian state, and it's likewise undeniable that Western states, and increasingly non-Western states, are taken to be the guarantors of a bundle of individual rights and privileges that we commonly refer to as liberal. As an historical claim, it seems clear that the arrangement of offices described above came to be only with the slow but steady emergence of centralized states in the early modern period. Even as states centralized the very powers that make them the commonly perceived enemy of liberals everywhere, they often exercised them in defense of individuals seeking to free themselves from the economic and political hierarchies that pervaded medieval Europe. In other words, to say that we live in a political system dominated by states is simultaneously to say that we live in a political system dominated by liberal states, or states that are held to a system of constraints that we refer to as liberals. Thus, in the same way, we might characterize the social and political order of, say, the 15th century Western Europe. We might say that this was a feudal order. We can say in the same way that the political order that has emerged in the past few centuries, particularly in the West, is a liberal order. Right? So liberalism here is the response to a question, what is our politics like? And I would point out here actually that I take most, to the extent that Marxism is a social scientific view, I would take the Marxist response to the question, what is liberal, to be this kind of response, right? Liberalism is, right, that political ideology that emerges with the rise of the bourgeoisie and the centralization of the nation state. Fourth question that liberalism represents an answer to is, I think, perhaps the the most neglected, but I think the most important in our particular predicament, the most important question. And that is the question of what kind of association is best, or on what terms are we to be associated with one another? In other words, liberalism is a kind of association between people that's distinct from alternative arrangements. And my comments here, and for much of the next 3 sessions, will borrow heavily from the work of Michael Oakeshott, and in particular his work on human conduct. Oakeshott identifies at least 2 types of associations that come into view in early modern Europe, what he calls, borrowing from the Latin, association as universitas and association as societas, which he then repurposes as ideal types of association, namely enterprise associations and civil associations, respectively. What defines an enterprise association, which is an association characterized by universitas, is purpose, right? Enterprise associations are associations defined and carried through on the basis of an acknowledged and shared purpose, a purpose to which all those associated can be expected to contribute and even to sacrifice. And this association could take a number of forms. It could be a church, it could be a corporation or a business entity, and it could be a nation state. Civil associations, on the other hand, characterized by societas, or a way of relating to each other, are associations that exist only insofar as they define the terms, which is to say the laws and customs, under which non-specified purposes can be peaceably pursued. They're non-instrumental in this sense. They don't orient us towards a common purpose. Rather, they specify the conditions under which we can pursue our own purposes, however we define them. To the extent that liberalism incorporates ideas and traditions like, say, state neutrality, particularly with respect to religious institutions, so in other words, to the extent that we expect the state to be sufficiently secular and neutral with regards to ends, to the extent that it incorporates ideas like the concept of a private sphere in which individuals can pursue projects by their own lights, shielded by necessary legal protections. And especially to the extent that liberals use or incorporate ideas like the rule of law, according to which individuals can rest easy that the mechanisms of the state and the potential violence of their neighbors will not be arbitrarily loosed upon them. In these ways, liberalism represents an answer or a set of answers, an answer that takes the form of civil association to the question of how we are to be associated with one another. And so those are 4 questions that I take liberalism or liberal to be a response to, or a set of responses to. So when it comes to defining liberalism, so here I'm moving on past these 4 questions, and I'm trying to think about what breaking liberalism down into these 4 questions or sets of responses to these questions, what it means for an inquiry about the liberal tradition. When it comes to defining liberalism, we have to ask not only which liberalism, i.e. contractarianism or 19th century French liberalism or new liberalism or post-war liberalism, we have to ask, and this is perhaps more important, liberalism with respect to what? Liberalism as a response to what set of questions? So these are, I think, the parameters of any investigation, any inquiry into liberalism or into liberal. But what about tradition? As in the liberal tradition, which is ostensibly what I'm supposed to be talking about. I think tradition can be treated a little bit more simply. Tradition's simple enough. It's something delivered across time. I mean, even etymologically, that's what tradition means. And it's delivered often from past generations to the new. So piecing together the liberal tradition is easy enough. We just have to ask ourselves, which liberal ideas have we inherited from the past and how do they fit together? But even an inquiry as simple as this has its stumbles and its pitfalls. And there's one set of obstacles in particular that those who identify as classical liberals should consider more thoughtfully. As Helen Rosenblatt has demonstrated in her recent book, The Lost History of Liberalism, which I recommend to everyone, the liberal tradition that we often articulate, that I often articulate, I mean, the liberal tradition that I teach every semester, has historical pieces that don't quite fit together. So it's the case that the classical liberals never, I mean, not once, called themselves liberal, but this hasn't really worried us much. It's their ideas we're after all, not their self-identifications. But as Rosenblatt points out, the assembly of the liberal tradition, and in particular, the assembly of this thing called classical liberalism, this took place at some time, and it was the work of some particular individuals doing intellectual work with clear political implications. Rosenblatt argues that it was the post-war intellectuals working to develop an ideological counterforce to European or Soviet-style socialism and communism that brought the classical liberal tradition to prominence. And I think she's probably mostly right. The details here aren't important. What's important is that Rosenblatt is clearly right in at least one way. What we mean by the classical liberal tradition can't accurately be described as an artifact of a purely historical excavation. Right? When we do this thing called the liberal tradition, we aren't just unearthing some already formed thing and presenting it. Right? We are putting the thing together as we look at it. Now, I'm actually less worried about this than others are. It seems obviously true to me that the articulation of an intellectual tradition, it can't simply be a purely historical inquiry. Assembling an intellectual tradition is always something done by someone, and it's always something done for some purpose. Now, it's true that the products of a purely historical inquiry carry a certain quality of objectivity, a certain rhetorical weight. Anything that can claim to have existed already, and especially existed already in the minds of people we consider to be great, like great thinkers, this is of value. Any reader of Hume knows that. We can trade on the presumed authority of great minds and on the presumed worthiness of ideas that have stood the test of time. And I think classical liberals often resist, sometimes quite staunchly resist, revisionist efforts to recast the liberal tradition, to question the character of its progenitors. And when I say to question the character of its progenitors, I mean to cancel its progenitors. To point out how its principles have been used at various historical moments, not to liberate, but often and sometimes to oppress and even enslave people. A liberal tradition can become, under the wrong historical and political circumstances, something of a straitjacket, something more akin to a religious dogma, making us not so much liberals, that is, people choosing to treat political questions under certain lights, but something much closer to followers of a creed rooted in revelation whose legacy we're cursed to defend unquestioningly. I think thinking of ourselves as guardians of a liberal tradition, and whether that means we see ourselves as self-appointed defenders of liberalism in the public square, or as, historian sentinels bringing the good ideas into the keep and turning away the bad ones, I think this can often lead us down paths that go to questionable destinations. The siren song of, the culture wars is difficult to resist, and it's only gotten more so because one's enemies furnish us new opportunities for righteous indignity on a daily basis. Culture warrior is no way to go through life, and it's certainly no way to go through the day-to-day of being a scholar, or even just someone trying to make sense of our social and political predicaments in a good faith way. If our inquiry into the liberal tradition isn't motivated by the desire to identify, polish, and defend something like a liberal canon or a liberal ideology, if that's not what we're doing, then what might our motivation be? Right? If we aren't going to be, in some sense, the self-appointed defenders of a tradition, what might we be? How might we identify? What might motivate us to conduct this inquiry? Well, we could try something pretty straightforward, and we could try seeing ourselves as liberals, i.e., as individuals loosely committed to the normative positions sketched above, and committed at least partly because of our own position within history and within a society that can descriptively be referred to as liberals. Right? There's nothing wrong with admitting, in other words, that we're interested in this thing, the liberal tradition, that we're interested in liberal ideas because we are already liberals, right? We haven't surveyed, the entire history of ideas and realized that liberalism is objectively the very best one. We're already, in some sense, committed to liberalism. We already identify as liberals. Almost everyone identifies as liberals. And so we can, in other words, begin our inquiry not as soldiers in a culture war, but as liberals trying to supply liberal answers to pressing questions. We can do this, and we can do this by understanding our position as one of inheritance. And I mean this inheritance in a kind of, in that lovely Burkean sense. We're recipients of ideas and texts across time, ideas and texts whose touch upon us is light, right, but indelible, ideas and texts that constrain us without binding us. More importantly, we stand not only to inherit these ideas and to inherit these texts, but to pass them on. That is, to transmit them again across time to students and to others. Like in a state, though, it's not enough to simply hold these ideas for a time, right? They need to be updated. They need to be modified. They need to be refitted for a changing world. This is just to say that like in a state that we've inherited, these ideas and in texts, they need to be improved. We are liberals. We're partisans in this sense, and standing in a stream of time, seeking to improve the ideas and institutions that go under the name liberal. And in this way, right, we can become actors or agents, intellectuals with agency, engaged in good faith efforts to interpret the world as intelligent beings engaged in inquiry. So that closes my remarks on liberalism and tradition, and what a liberal tradition might be, or how we might begin to approach the question of liberal tradition. And I want to just take a moment to specify the terms of my own inquiry in this session and the next two sessions. My inquiry here has to do with liberalism and illiberalism. And if it's tough to define liberalism, right, it's tougher to define illiberalism, because there's a sense in which you can't define a negative of something without knowing what it is. More than this, my topic is liberalism and illiberalism as they currently stand, or as they appear to currently stand. So from the start, we have some clues as to which liberal resources we must call upon, some initial inclinations, in other words, regarding the liberal with respect to what questions that we discussed above. In particular, it seems clear to me when we look at the contemporary political landscape, the contemporary political ideological landscape, that liberal responses to the question of authority, for example, they don't seem particularly well suited for the times. Now, we may hear, and actually, just to be clear what I'm saying here, maybe I understood, the questions of authority that animate the Anglo-American traditions, right? The question of under what terms does government claim authority? Is authority made moral? These questions don't seem to me particularly relevant to our situation in 2020. I mean, we hear daily grumblings along the political right in particular about the so-called deep state, right? The deep state, which I take to be a kind of 21st century mashup of somewhat fringe, but largely folk-oriented fears about government in general, sort of anti-government sentiment or paranoia. This on the one hand, and then more long-standing and respectable conservative intellectual concerns about the threat posed by the administrative state to individual liberty on the other, right? Bring these two together, the kind of militia meets Tocqueville sort of phenomenon. Despite these deep state grumblings, the legitimacy of the liberal state seems not particularly at question. Right? This is not to say that questions about what the state ought to have authority to do aren't relevant. And indeed, questions about police brutality, for example, these questions often turn on responses to the question of what means the state has available to it to exercise its duties. But the US government, like most governments administering prosperous secular states, it seems today to be on quite solid footing. And so there's a sense in which, right, the second treatise, for all that it's given us over the years, can maybe be de-emphasized, or to use a term of art, can be perhaps de-centered. And we might look to other liberal sources for guidance on how to proceed today. Now, I don't mean by this in any way to rule out questions of legitimacy or authority for all time, or to rule them out for the time being. I mean this only to clarify my position, our position as liberals ascertaining the state of affairs that surround us. Our position is one defined partly by our commitments to the liberal order, partly by the resources within the liberal tradition available to us, and partly, but perhaps quite substantially, by the nature of the current threats to liberalism as we see them. At any given moment, invoking the liberal tradition is going to be a matter of determining which political questions are being most pointedly asked, which liberal concepts and ideas are appropriate and ready at hand, and how these ideas might be put to new uses, to liberal uses. Right, so we're looking not so much to defend the liberal tradition as to think like liberals. Very, very briefly, I'll just sketch out what my position is here and what my position is going to be in the next 2 sessions. And for those of you who haven't looked at the schedule, there are basically 4 sessions in this series. The first one is almost done. This is my presentation of what I take to be the liberal tradition, or how I'm going to approach the liberal tradition in my comments to follow. The second one, the exact title of which I forget, is going to consider what I take to be left liberal positions and left illiberal positions. So in other words, how liberalism guides us left, and how ideas within the liberal tradition ultimately lead to illiberal positions. And then the third session is going to be basically the same thing on the right. Now, I'll just preface my remarks by saying that it is my current view, my position is that the threats presented to the liberal order are much stronger on the right in 2020 than they have been in the past. And then the final session, the fourth session, is a kind of Q&A between myself and Bradley Jackson at IHS. Now, my position here and in the next few sessions is that the most pressing questions facing liberals today are 2 of the 4 that I listed above, 2 of the 4 sets of questions that I listed above. In particular, the questions of which sorts of institutions most effectively minimize the threat of arbitrary power in the lives of individuals. And so that's the second set of questions. The set of questions in response to which figures like Hume and Montesquieu and Constant loom particularly large. And secondly, the question of how we are to be associated with one another, right? The fourth set of questions. And just as a preview, I'm going to argue that I think actually this fourth set of questions, the nature of association that obtains in a liberal order, I actually think that this is the single most pressing question that we have available to us, right? In other words, so if we think about something like blood in soil, right? Blood in soil is an enterprise association, right? It suggests that we are, all of us, engaged in or expected to be engaged in some project of racial health. Thrown in altar, likewise, is an enterprise association, right? It's not just whether or not we subscribe to a particular altar. It's not just whether or not we think a particular throne is legitimate, right? It's the fact that thrown in altar places our own projects in a secondary position, right? We're expected to be committed to and to contribute to the realization of some larger project. Likewise on the left, right? There's a sense in which many of the projects that exist on the so-called social justice left or on the so-called socialist left, some of these positions likewise shift us or aim to shift us from a kind of civil association, an association interested only in the terms by which we can each pursue our individual projects. They aim to move us into a more enterprise association conception of our lives, in which we are each of us responsible for contributing to some larger project, and in which our failure to contribute to that project, our failure to speak up, for example, our failure to use certain terms in conversation, that these can actually represent a failure to properly contribute to this common project. So it's 11:40. I was supposed to go for 40 minutes. I'll end my comments there and open it up for Q&A.
Professor Turner, thank you. So we have several questions in the queue, and if you in the audience have questions, feel free to drop that into the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through all the questions, but we will certainly try to get through as many as we can. So the first question comes from Matthew. Can you elaborate on how liberals can distinguish between the extent of suffrage and popular sovereignty? More specifically, how can the people at large be sovereign if suffrage isn't universal?
I mean, in a number of ways, right? I mean, so there's a kind of historical question. How have people in the past articulated a vision of popular sovereignty that included within it limited suffrage? And so no, that's a question, and there are a number of answers to it. I mean, we currently have this today. Now, you might hold the position that we don't actually have a government that is popular, that satisfies the conditions of popular sovereignty. But if you do hold that position, if you think that the current U.S. government, right, under which we hold elections, that we tend to think of as universal suffrage type elections, it's nonetheless the case that we don't have universal suffrage, right? So people under the age of 18 can't vote. There are other conditions, many of which determined by the various states, under which you can lose or forfeit your right to vote. And we have reason to think that, I mean, there are literally millions, if not tens of millions of people who live here whose legal status as citizens prohibit them from voting. So in other words, the concept of popular sovereignty and the concept of suffrage are related, but they don't overlap completely. You could imagine all sorts of theories of popular sovereignty that don't have any sort of suffrage at all. In fact, I would actually say that Hobbes has an example of popular sovereignty under which there is literally no suffrage, or ideally there would be no suffrage.
Alonzo asks, I continue to struggle with the applied anthropology of liberalism. I don't understand how in many schools of liberal thought, one can find this utter distrust of social institutions that coexists with a blind trust in individuals, when at the end of the day, it's individuals that create and run those social institutions. Can you comment?
Yeah, so there's a version of this that's like that. There's that lovely image. It's a GIF. It's on the internet, and it says, something like people can't be trusted, so we need a government that is comprised of people who can't be trusted. I mean, it's like this circular kind of thing, which in many ways, to me, is a beautiful representation of public choice and analysis in general. But it's a good question. In other words, what sorts of activities do we think that people ought to be responsible for? I think liberals tend to take a far more expansive view of that for two reasons. I think you actually, on the one hand, liberals take a more expansive view of what individuals are capable of, or what they ought to be capable of in their own private lives, partly because liberalism, at least I think liberalism, tends not to rank ways of life, right? So again, if you had a highly perfectionist view of politics, or to put this another way, if you saw our common association as, properly speaking, an enterprise association, and if this enterprise association was religious in character, right? So say you thought that the United States government had an obligation to encourage people by force if necessary to attend church or to perform certain religious sacraments, and you thought this because performing these sacraments and attending church meant you were engaged in objectively better ways of life than if you weren't to engage in these. Liberals tend not to see it that way, right? So liberals tend to see most projects as in some, at least equally viable, equally morally viable. And so in that case, if there is no objective ordering of projects, who is to judge which projects are worth pursuing, which ones aren't? Most liberals tend to think that individuals are capable of determining which projects can be pursued and which ones can't. Liberals also tend to take a characteristically skeptical view of what government is capable of doing. So, while liberals do acknowledge that government, conceived as a kind of blunt instrument, has a role to play in protecting citizens, protecting them from each other, protecting them from associations and those who would interfere with their ways of life, we tend to take a pretty skeptical view of the capacity or the ability of government to, in some sense, manage the details of someone's everyday life.
Did 20th century fusionism or right libertarianism diminish the liberal elements of its ideology by overly focusing on economic concerns or physical aggression or the non-aggression principle to the exclusion of other liberal questions?
So it's an interesting question. If you're a libertarian, you'd say no, right? If you're a libertarian, you would say that it was, that guys like Frank Meyer, in some sense, saved the American right from a kind of thrown in altar position, basically. So, I mean, I would say that it partly depends on your evaluation of what we think of as classical political economy, or the 20th century revival of classical political economy. I would say, if anything, within the right fusionist movement has been, you might say, disastrous for liberals in general, it is probably the evangelical portion of right fusionism. And I'm actually going to talk about that in the third session.
And as a follow-up, do you think that that tension within the fusionist project has left liberals, maybe classical liberals or liberals more broadly today, ill-equipped to confront the rise of the illiberal right?
Yeah, I mean, I have plenty to say on this, and you can email. I mean, I don't want to say like too much. I don't want to get too overtly political, but I mean, fusionism was a political project. I think we tend to look back at fusionism. We tend to look back at movement conservatism of the 70s and 80s. We look back at it through the lens of the last 4 years, right? So in other words, if Trumpism is like the denouement of fusionism, or the logical end result of fusionism, then what possible use is fusionism? I think there's a more sympathetic reading that looks back at the at the work of somebody like Frank Meyer or Robert Nisbet, looks at what the realities they were facing in the late 40s and the early 50s. I mean, the more libertarian elements, the more socially liberal elements of the left now were not as pronounced in the 40s and 50s. The situation, in other words, the situation was significantly different. In other words, I'm willing to extend fusionists a lot of leeway based on what they saw themselves as being up against, even if we can nonetheless point out that on the one hand, take a guy like Buckley, to the extent that Buckley is the figurehead of the fusionist movement. I mean, Buckley got everything wrong. I mean, just one after another, wrong on civil rights, wrong on Vietnam, wrong on executive power, wrong on Nixon, wrong on everything. And so to the extent that Buckley's errors, right, have been inherited by the movement, sure, fusionism was bad. But again, I don't think it had to be bad. I think some conscious choices were made at some point. Again, I don't want to get too far into this, but yeah. But there's nothing wrong with disentangling fusionism, right? There's nothing wrong with isolating the parts that were formerly fused and saying, hey, listen, there's a lot to like in this, right? I can assign my students, I don't know, Tocqueville or Robert Novak or something like that, and not think twice about it, while at the same time saying, maybe evangelicalism as a political movement is a complete disaster.
How important is neoliberalism to your understanding of neoliberalism, and should we expect that to be incorporated later in the series?
I don't plan on treating neoliberalism at any length in the following sessions. I mean, it's a funny term. 10 years ago, particularly if you were in the academy, right, it was in many ways the ultimate pejorative. That to be associated, I mean, just if a little inside baseball for academia, but I mean, like, compare the relative fates or the relative status of somebody like Hayek in the 90s in academy to somebody like Heidegger or somebody like Carl Schmitt. There really is, and I mean, I realize this whataboutism stuff is so tiresome, but it really is bizarre that you can be an actual Nazi. Carl Schmitt's not even just a Nazi. I mean, Heidegger was a Nazi. Schmitt was, an ideological architect of Nazism. The court intellectual of Hitler. And, one is going to report you to your dean or whatever for teaching Carl Schmitt. But you take a neoliberal like Hayek or Friedman or something like that, and you've got problems. I at this current juncture, I don't have strong views on the term neoliberal. I don't think it's terribly helpful. I do think that the more positive movement that sort of self-identifies as neoliberalism, so in particular like the neoliberal Twitter handle, for example, I think there's a lot to like about that. I think there are a lot of good elements there, and I think that it represents an example of a movement that is that identifies itself as liberal, and that is excavating the liberal tradition for liberal answers to new and pressing questions. If we're going to have liberalism in the 21st century, it's going to be a neoliberalism, and that's part of my point. It's going to be new. We can only carry around the second treatise for so long.
So you have placed the individual in the foreground of your account of liberalism. Patrick Deneen's description of liberalism also identifies the individual as fundamental to liberal politics, along with the idea of, quote, human separation from and opposition to nature. Do you agree that this is fundamental to liberalism in some way?
So no. I read Deneen's book. I profited from Deneen's book. I would recommend anyone picking it up. He's a clear and lucid writer. I think he makes a series of important mistakes. The most relevant to this question is his tendency to run together liberalism and everything else that's happened in the past 400 years. So, and actually, this seems to be an intellectual sin that one finds a lot on the right, which is the tendency to move between categories like liberal, modern, and sort of liberalism, modernity, and say something like capitalism or libertarianism, something like that, to move between these without noting that that we're moving. I think it's the case that there's a very modern attitude that has many of the characteristics that Deneen identifies, its attitude towards nature, for example. But the idea that liberalism is in some sense committed to what he calls anti-culture, that it's committed to the eradication of community and of associational life, that it's committed to the eradication of nature. I just think that's totally wrong, and I see no reason for that to be the case. In fact, I think the best forms of liberalism are those that incorporate, the insights of communitarianism, for example, the insights of environmentalism, and all this kind of thing. I mean, just to give one example for someone who was interested in Deneen, take a look at one of the last books that Roger Scruton wrote before he died, the title of which escapes me at the moment, but it was basically a Scrutonite defense of environmentalism, which of course he articulates in a way totally separate from the more common articulations of the environmental ideology. He articulates it in this very characteristically Scrutonian and conservative way. So no, I think Deneen runs together things that ought to be kept separate. Most of the things that he characterizes are bad. Many of the things that he characterizes or that he identifies are definitely things around us, but whether or not they're attributable to liberalism is a separate question, and it's one that he doesn't take up.
To your point about perhaps de-emphasizing some of the more major central texts of the liberal tradition in the 18th and 19th centuries in light of our current era. Are there any useful ancient, classical, medieval antecedents for what actually existing liberalism in 2020 looks like and the concerns that it is faced with now? Or is the material that we must work with largely still within that 17th century on framework?
That's a good question. And so I teach the ancients. I have a difficult time sort of thinking with the ancients, as it were. There's still something that's sort of alien about them to me. That is, I think, a shortcoming of my own. It's certainly the case that I have been told by others, that I've had it explained to me by others, sometimes quite convincingly, that liberals have a lot to learn from figures like Aristotle, figures like Cicero, for example. In fact, actually, Rosenblatt's book, just the one that I mentioned in my talk, Rosenblatt's book begins, I think, with a discussion of Cicero. So I think there's plenty there. If there was an ancient author that I think is most useful for liberals, I would probably say Augustine. Right, the secularist reading of Augustine, in particular of the second book of the second part of City of God, I think is extremely important, particularly in thinking about the limits of, again, what Oakeshott called universitas. So the limits of how far we can all be considered to be engaged in one large purpose. I mean, nobody would have loved to argue that we are engaged in one large purpose. No one would have loved to argue that mankind is one large universitas than Augustine, right, based on his religious commitments. And yet he gives us all sorts of very subtle arguments for why that's not the case.
All right, we have time for one last question. Do you think that despite claims to value pluralism, liberalism actually presupposes a conception of the good in terms of bourgeois values?
I do, actually, but I don't see why that's necessarily opposite of liberal pluralism, right? So, or just value pluralism in general. I think it's the case that something like bourgeois commitments to individual autonomy, right? If value pluralism is itself an ideal that has to be realized, right? That some arrangement of institutions, some arrangement of arguments have to be in place before value pluralism can be realized. I think it's probably bourgeois liberalism that gives us the best shot at realizing it. So no, it isn't. So to the extent that value pluralism is somehow negated by a kind of common and unquestioned commitment to, the moral primacy of the individual, whatever you want to say, then sure, yeah. I mean, if you think that explodes the value pluralist project, then that's an argument. But I don't think that it is. I think the value pluralist project has to be realized in some sense through individuals acting on their own, acting according to their own lights.